think of ourselves as the most powerful beings in the universe, it's unsettling to discover that we're wrong. Time has come to see the world as it is.
Can we pull back the veil of static and reach into the source of all being? Behind this curtain, this random pattern generator, you will be responsible for an escalation that will destroy everything.
On this episode, the sections dealing with my personal experiences are going to be much shorter. On the next episode, those sections will be much longer, and I'm going to get into something very major, a big step in this podcast. So I wanted that episode to be episode 20 rather than episode 19. So this episode will just be just a handful of some more strange accounts from my past. And now, the news.
What the hell in God's name is going down here?
Alright, in this episode, I'm going to start out the news section with the Dover Demon. Alright, the only witnesses to catch sight of the Dover Demon were all teenagers. Bill Bartlett, with friends Mike and Andy, all 17, was the first to see the strange creature which suddenly appeared around Dover, Massachusetts. It was a clear, dry evening on the 21st of April, 1977, at about 10:30 p.m. The three friends were driving along a road bordered by trees, fields, and widely spaced houses. Suddenly, the headlights illuminated a strange creature which Bill, at first, thought was a cat or dog picking its way along a low stone wall beside the road. When he saw it more clearly, he realized it was definitely no cat or dog. It had a large head shaped like a watermelon, from which shone large eyes like two orange marbles, but Bill could not make out any ears, nose, or mouth. A thin neck joined the large head to a thin body. The arms and legs were long and thin, with long fingers and toes. Seemingly hairless, the creature had a peach-colored skin with a rough texture. Overall, it was 3 to 4 feet tall. As an amateur artist, Bill was observant, and the creature's strange appearance impressed itself on his memory as he drove past it at a distance of about 20 feet. The sighting was later estimated to have lasted for 5 or 6 seconds, and after they had driven past, Bill immediately said to his friends, "Did you see that?" Neither of them had, Mike looking out at the other side of the road and Andy in the back talking to Mike. When Bill described what he had seen, they wanted to go back and look for it, but Bill had been frightened by the creature's weird appearance. No way," he responded. "When you see something like that, you don't want to stand around and see what it's going to do." However, after a mile, he was persuaded to turn around and drive back, but they saw nothing. When they got home, Bill was still upset, as his father later told investigators. He straight away made a drawing of the creature, while the details were still clear in his memory. Meanwhile, later that same evening, another young Dover resident had a close encounter with the demon. It was just after midnight when 15-year-old John Baxter set out to walk, or hitchhike, home from his girlfriend's house. He was just over a mile away from the site of the Bartlett encounter, about which he knew nothing, when he saw something walking towards him on the same side of the road. As it was very dark, he could make out no details, and from the person's height, thought it might be a kid he knew. So he called out, but there was no answer. The figure stopped when it was 25 feet away, and John stopped too, calling out, "Who is that?" The creature then scuttled off down a wooded gully, and John went after it for a short distance. When he stopped, he could see it standing about 30 feet away, with the long fingers of both hands gripping a tree trunk and its toes curled around a rock. Like Bill, he could see 2 light eyes, but no other facial features. As they stood watching each other, John felt nervous and went back up to the road, walking as fast as he could away from the spot. He too drew a sketch, and later when the stories got out, he showed it to Bill Bartlett, who was amazed at its remarkably close resemblance to the creature he had seen. Nearly 24 hours after John Baxter's sighting, 2 more Dover youngsters saw what was almost certainly the same creature. 18-year-old Will Tangtor was driving 15-year-old Abby Brabham home at about midnight on the 22nd of April. Will knew about Bill Bartlett's sighting as the two were close friends, but Abby had heard nothing about it. She was the first to see the demon, and she got a better look at it than Will, who only saw it fleetingly. It was crouched on all fours beside the road, and they passed about 8 feet from it. It had a large oblong head, a hairless tan or beige body, and no nose, mouth, or ears were noticeable. Abby remarked on its round, bright, green glowing eyes, as contrasted with the orange eyes described by Bill. As with the earlier witnesses, neither Will nor Abby wanted to stop and get a closer look. Indeed, Abby asked Will to drive faster. This plainly demonstrates that the creature was something unfamiliar. It is unlikely that all 4 witnesses would have failed to recognize a dog or cat or goat or other often seen creature. At the end of February 1981 in Arnold, Pennsylvania, 5 boys aged 11 to 16 were spending their Saturday afternoon in the railway yard when 11-year-old Chris saw a little creature squatting down with its back to him. He crept up to it, determined to catch it, He grabbed it and lifted it up, shouting for the others to help. It wriggled and twisted and squealed so much that he was forced to drop it, and it ran into a drain pipe. The boys agreed that the strange creature was green in color, naked and without hair or fur, but with wrinkled elephant skin, which felt dry and rubbery, like elastic. It was just under 3 feet tall, humanoid in shape, with nipples, large ears, and a tail 1 inch long, and it walked upright on 2 legs. On May 29, 1986, in Santa Rosa, La Pampa, Argentina, dogs barking and a loud buzzing noise outside the house awoke 28-year-old Oscar Alberto Flores, who on opening his bedroom window saw an object hovering above the treetops. Turning around, he noticed 2 beings standing at his bedroom door. The beings were about 8 feet tall and had long, thin hands, each of which had only 3 fingers, the middle one being the longest. Their faces were expressionless since they lacked a nose, mouth, or ears. Their eyes were small and dark. Flores could not see their legs as they were obscured by the bed. The beings wore tight-fitting silvery overalls, a belt from which hung accessories, and a necklace with a large medallion. The beings gesticulated constantly, but Flores understood nothing of their meaning. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, the beings vanished. Flores immediately went outside and saw a ball-shaped object heading south. He then left for the police station to report the incident. Flores claims that his face peeled after the contact. His parents and friends also noticed a change in his personality. Flores, the extrovert, had become a worrying introvert. In 1979, the mine survival of death was recognized in an American courtroom. The occasion was the trial of a man named Alan Showery for the murder of a Filipino nurse, Teresita Basa. She was stabbed to death in her apartment in Evanston, Illinois, on 21st February 1977. Medical evidence indicated that the 48-year-old nurse had led a man into her apartment and that he had encircled her neck from behind in a Japanese half-Nelson and rendered her unconscious. Then he had stripped her and stabbed her between the ribs with such force that the knife went right through her. He left her in a position that suggested rape to confuse the investigation, his real motive was robbery, then set the place on fire. 2 weeks later, in the Edgewater hospital where Teresita Basa had worked, one of her colleagues remarked to another Filipino, a respiratory therapist named Remy Chua, "Teresita must be turning in her grave. Too bad she can't tell the police who did it." And Remy Chua replied seriously, "She can come to me in a dream. I'm not afraid." Later that day, as she was dozing in the locker room, Remy Chua opened her eyes to see Teresita Basa standing in front of her. She ran out of the room in a panic. Remy Chua then began to dream of the murder and of the killer, whom she then recognized as a hospital orderly named Alan Showery. And one day, as she lay on her bed, a voice spoke through her mouth saying, "I am Teresita Basa. I want you to tell the police." The voice spoke in Tagalog, the native language of the Philippines. Her husband heard the words, although Remy Chua remembered nothing when she recovered from her trance. They decided to do nothing about it. 2 weeks later, Teresita came back and spoke through Remy Chua's mouth again, this time naming her killer as Alan. A few days later, she named him as Alan Showery, and said he had stolen her jewelry and given it to his girlfriend. She even gave the telephone number of someone who could identify the jewelry. She claimed that Al had come to fix her television and killed her. Finally, the Chuas called the police. They were unconvinced, and it was several days before they questioned Showery, who admitted promising to repair Teresita's television, but claimed he had simply forgotten. However, when the police questioned Showery's live-in girlfriend Yanka, and asked her if he had ever given her jewelry, she showed them an antique ring that he had given her as a belated Christmas present. The police called the number that Mrs. Chua had spoken in her trance, and 2 of the victim's cousins came to the station and identified the ring as Teresita's. They also identified some other jewelry that had belonged to her. Faced with this evidence, Showery broke down and confessed. At the trial in January 1979, the defense argued that the case should be dismissed on the grounds that the evidence had been, apparently, provided by a ghost, and implied that ghosts were untrustworthy. Judge Frank W. Barbero overruled the objection, but the jury obviously had its doubts and confessed to being hopelessly deadlocked. At a second trial a month later, however, Showery changed his plea to guilty and was sentenced to 14 years in prison. Early in January 1967, in Point Pleasant, West Virginia, Mary Heyer was working late in her office across from the county courthouse when a little man entered. He was about 4 feet 6 inches tall, she said later, and had very strange eyes covered with thick lensed glasses. His black hair was long and cut squarely like a bull haircut. Although it was about 20 degrees Fahrenheit outside, he was wearing a short-sleeved blue shirt and blue trousers of thin material. He kept his right hand in his pocket at all times. Speaking in a low, halting voice, he asked her for directions to Welch, West Virginia. She thought at first that he had some kind of speech impediment, and for some reason he terrified her. Quote, "He kept getting closer and closer," she said, his funny eyes staring at me almost hypnotically. Alarmed, she ran into the back room where the newspaper circulation manager was working on a telephone campaign. He joined her, and they spoke together to the little man. Quote, "He seemed to know more about West Virginia than we did," she declared. At one point the telephone rang, and while she was speaking on it, the little man picked up a ballpoint pen from her desk and looked at it in amazement. Quote, as if he had never seen a pen before. She gave him a pen and said he laughed in a loud, strange way as he took it. Then he ran out into the night and disappeared around a corner. Being a good newspaper woman, Mrs. Heyer later checked with the police to find out if there was any mentally deficient person on the loose who fitted the little man's description. There wasn't. Several weeks later, Mrs. Heyer was crossing the street near her office when she again saw this very same man. He appeared startled when he noticed her watching him, turned abruptly and ran for a large black car which suddenly rounded the corner. It was driven by a very large man. The little man sprang into it and it sped away. And now some reports from China. Changbai, Manchuria. Monster seen swimming in lake, about 6 feet long, black reptilian with oval head and long neck. Several sightings, and one witness shot at it and missed, 1980. Near Chongqing, Sichuan province, peasant out in field saw entity with huge head wearing one-piece spacesuit which looked metallic and shone brightly. Head was in helmet, and entity walked stiffly but fast. Witness ran away, but looking back the entity had vanished. End of August 1971. In Dadi Gully, Zhaozi County, Shaanxi Province, man cutting wood saw a hairy wild man which stood within 6 feet of him for an hour until witness threw a rock at it and retreated. Early June 1977. Shortly afterwards, there was another encounter here with a similar creature. 21st July 1977. Dongtinghu Lake, Hunan Province. Cries for help heard from a rock. 1981. Gaolingan Mountain Region, South Yunnan. Anyone who stands by pools called the Mysterious Lakes and shouts is rewarded by a rain shower. The louder the yell, the heavier the rain. The longer the yell, the longer the rain lasts. 1981. Lake Hanas. Lake monsters identified as giant red salmon 33 feet long. 1985. Longzhou, Gansu Province. Students saw luminous black being in vegetable garden. 2 others saw him 2 days later, 29th July 1974. Chinese Boeing 747 en route from Beijing to Paris saw fast UFOs pacing plane for 2 minutes, 11th June 1985. Maishan, Sichuan Province. Noisy, reddish-orange UFO, like large straw hat, seen hovering at midnight for 30 minutes, 7th March 1987. Northern China. At 36,000 feet, mystery falling object broke off part of a tailplane of Chinese military plane, which landed safely, 2nd November 1983. Kaohsiung Commune, Hubei Province. Woman cutting grass for pigs saw red hairy creature rubbing its back against a tree. Primate hairs were collected. 19th June 1976. In Xinjiang, Hebei Province, UFO with dome, giving out white light, flew 15 to 20 feet above ground, September 1943. In Shanghai, statue of the Immaculate Heart of Mary in Church on Hill, near Shanghai, wept for 3 days, 1953. Shendongjia Mountains, Hubei Province, more than 300 sightings of wild men recorded since 1920s, and expeditions have gone in search of them. In Tashkurgan, hairy man-beast shot and killed, 1944. Tashkurgan is where borders of China, India, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and USSR meet, adjoining Tajikistan and USSR, where wild men are still seen. Tianqi, Heaven Lake, Baitul Mountain, lake monster reports over last century. In Tong Yo Kiao, remains of Blessed Maria Assunta Pelota were found to be perfectly preserved 8 years after her death, April 1913. Yunnan Province, soldiers killed and ate a Yeti-like creature, 1962. Zhongpu County, Fujian Province, 2 large luminous orange objects descended on outdoor cinema audience of 3,000 and swept diagonally across, almost scraping the ground and causing panic. 2 children died and 200 were injured. 7th of July, 1977. Zhejiang Province, 2 lorry drivers and convoys saw UFO and 2 strange figures on the road in 2 locations. Entities were about 4.5 feet tall, wearing helmets and spacesuits with backpacks and cylinders. All disappeared when one driver got out of his cab, 13th December 1979. In Nicosia, Argentina, multiple witnesses claim they saw the same humanoid-type creature hovering over the beaches of Nicosia in 2 separate incidents in May. 2 middle-aged technicians working for a major corporation who provided their full names but requested to remain anonymous told Guillermo D. Jimenez that it was cold and rainy when the sighting took place from their apartment on the 11th floor. Quote, "We were looking through the window of the apartment located facing the sea, and something caught our attention. We could see some strange lights lighting the very edge of the sea," they said. Imagine our surprise when moments after seeing these lights, we saw a person walking in that direction out of thin air. The figure vanished moments later, as did the strange lights on the shore, they added. 2 days later, and according to the additional witnesses, the mysterious figure reappeared. Guadalupe P. and her daughter Marcela P. caught a glimpse of the same creature, quote, floating as it walked on the shore. My 17-year-old daughter summoned me because she had seen something strange moving along the seashore from south to north. I should explain that we live facing the sea on the 11th floor. It was a clear but very cold night. An ethereal figure in whitish hues, yet simultaneously transparent, could be made out, said 52-year-old Guadalupe. The strange figure, she said, was about 5 feet tall. As they turned off their lights in their apartment in order to take a better look, they were able to confirm that the humanoid was traveling in the air. Quote, it gave the impression of flying in the air. Its feet were unsupported. Facing our seaside apartment there is a wooden platform used in the summer as a bar and refreshment vending point, and this figure stopped there for a few seconds before moving on. We saw it for a few meters but lost it from sight in front of the sandbanks. It should be noted that the beaches are lit up to that point. We don't know if it went to the sea or kept walking toward the seawall, she recounted. Marcela, who allegedly saw the floating figure first, says she was able to see it flying clearly. Quote, I called my mom over so she could look, and as she regarded it for a few seconds, realized it wasn't a person, since it didn't appear to be wearing clothes, a scarf, hat, or shoes. As I said earlier, it was a very cold night. It was moving in the air as if floating. It kept going for some 330 feet until it reached a platform with wooden pilings that is used in the summer as a refreshment stand. It stopped there, lingering a few seconds, and kept going another 490 feet, although its figure became less noticeable. It became more diffuse, until it finally vanished altogether. This is the first time I've seen something like this. I was stunned. For that reason, I kept looking through the balcony at night, hoping to see something like it again, she explained. Nicosia is a beach city in the southwest of Buenos Aires province and is located on the Atlantic coast. In 2007, a police officer from Mexico admitted to being attacked by a similar flying humanoid while on patrol in the city of Monterrey. New York. A man says he and his pregnant girlfriend were attacked by an unknown humanoid they said came out of a UFO in the southwestern part of the borough of Brooklyn. The man, who chose to remain anonymous, said on Sunday that they were sitting on a bench located around West 31st when they noticed a flash of light in the sky. Quote, all of a sudden, the sand on the beach rolled up like a wave, and then some craft, all black, was above us, the man said, adding that they were not able to run, as he implied that the bright light was paralyzing the couple. We couldn't move. I could see people walking past in my peripheral vision. My girlfriend was up with tears in her eyes. That's when the eyewitness says the humanoid figure showed up, stepping behind the woman. It then vanished. We took off running, and as we reached West 31st, we saw something above the clouds. The man estimated the craft to be larger than Central Park, and exhibited a circle of lights that appeared to rotate counterclockwise. Then, reportedly, a few additional smaller craft came out of the larger one. The eyewitnesses say they were able to count them. Quote, 13 smaller crafts came from the larger one, heading in separate directions. Then there was something that looked like a cloud, shaped like a ruler with definition. Another 7 black crafts in the same shape came out of it, he claims. The sky turned all sorts of colors, and the clouds rolled in an indescribable way. The event, which purportedly took place a week prior to the terror attacks of September 11, 2001, was believed to be the cause of an unusual dark mark on the baby's heel, the man said. He was born on the 15th. On his left foot there is a dark mark, very defined, that looks like a UFO or pyramid. No other witnesses allegedly present during the incident have so far come forward. Last month, another Brooklyn woman claimed to being sexually assaulted by alien beings and added that babies were being taken away from their mothers. In Nigeria, police in the city of Port Harcourt claimed 3 boys have the ability to become cats at will. The incident reportedly began when the officers became curious about a cat roaming the police station and decided to capture it. But when, for some reason, they tried to kill it, the cat, quote, mysteriously transformed into a boy, the men said. The boy allegedly confessed that he and many others of his kind are capable of metamorphosing into felines with the sole purpose of, quote, sucking human blood and inflicting their victims with diseases. According to John, he learned the art from a man named Womati. Ezi Duboise Wobo, ruler of the region, said that he had spoken with one of the alleged mentors, who had confessed to him that the entire story was true. He also told that these men recruit school children and then use items such as native alligator pepper, local gin, local cola nut, and packaged beef roll in order to initiate them. Port Harcourt is the capital of Rivers State in Nigeria and has a population of 1,382,592. Shapeshifting is the purported ability of a living thing to physically transform into another being, and it is present in works such as the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Iliad. The belief is also in existence in many cultures around the world, like the Native American skinwalker. and similar creatures documented in African shamanism.
What the hell in God's name is going down here?
That was a public service announcement designed to scare the shit out.
Yeah, you may be aware of folklore about little people. People generally considered that sort of thing to only come from like the British Isles, but actually cultures from all over the world have stories about other races of intelligent beings that are smaller in stature than humans. And I actually have talked to some people in my personal life that claim to have seen little people. A friend of mine I mentioned who would do energy healing and massage, he told me that once he and some friends heard a rustling in a bush and looked over and they swore that there was a little man. Just a little guy just rooting around in the bush, and he saw him and ran off. Another friend of mine says that when he was a kid, he walked into his bedroom and saw a little person sitting on the edge of his bed. And the little guy looked very startled to see him and jumped over the side of the bed and ran around the corner. And as soon as my friend rounded the corner, he was gone. He couldn't find him under the bed or anything. Now, there's an interesting story from this guy I talked to in Hawaii when I was there visiting my brother and sister-in-law. He was a local who told me that he liked to go fishing down at the beach, and said one day that he was out by himself, bringing his fishing rod and gear out to the beach, and was in an area where there was, up on the tree line, a collection of huts. And he says that when he was getting his stuff ready, he saw a small figure, maybe about 3 feet tall or something, moving very fast from the huts towards the shore, a bit of a distance from him. But he said the thing that really disturbed him was not only how fast it was moving, but also that it wasn't running or walking. It was seeming to float a couple of inches over the sand. And it got to the shoreline and stopped, and then noticed him, and he just swears that it was this little guy in a robe who was just floating over the ground. And he gathered his stuff and ran. He got his fishing rod and his tackle box and got the hell out of there. Now, another possible haunting story I remember happened to me. These friends of mine once lived in this house together that was a pretty old house in Birmingham, Alabama. They would claim to hear footsteps in the house at night. My friend would get his shotgun and go out into the living room, expecting to find somebody breaking in, and there would never be anybody there. But one night when a friend and I were watching the place for them when they were gone, we were just hanging out, listening to music, talking, drinking beers, and in the middle of us being very loud and happy and laughing, there was just some horrible feeling descended on everything. It was as if somebody turned a light off, only it was just all the joy was sucked out of the room in an instant. There was nothing to trigger it, no sight, no sound. All of a sudden, we both just shut down. And we just stared around the room, and I was like, you feel that? And he's like, yeah, I feel that. What's going on? And I was like, I don't know. And then we just felt this very distinct presence come into the room. It felt very unhappy with us. It felt like something that was very angry. It did not want us there. We didn't see anything. We didn't hear anything. But then, after a little while of just sitting there feeling incredibly uncomfortable and scared, the presence suddenly left the room, and we were just like, what the hell was that? But it may have had something to do with the sounds that my friends who live there would hear. In the next episode, I'm going to get into something rather out there, so yeah, hold on tight for that one.
He was abducted by aliens earlier this afternoon. That little girl got lost under the bed and she went into an alternate dimension.
This is called Star People by Richard Wagamese, and it was posted to WordPress.com on May 23rd, 2011. I'm a science buff, and I try to keep up on anything new and startling and interesting. So it was fascinating for me to read that they've discovered evidence of water on Mars. As a stargazer, that kind of news got my attention. All of us, I suppose, who've ever been affected by popular science fiction, have wondered about the possibility of Martians, and the fact that there might once have been water there only lends strength to the mystery. The red planet, aliens, ray guns, the stuff of wonder. My people tell of star people, who came to us many generations ago. The star people brought spiritual teachings and stories and maps of the cosmos, and they offered these freely. They were kind, loving, and set a great example. When they left us, my people say there was a loneliness like no other. Now, I'm not saying the star people of legend were Martians, but I am saying that the fascination with the heavens and the awesome possibilities that exist out there lives throughout cultures across the globe. Mars, our closest neighbor, has always been a magnet for our attention. All those possible worlds. That's what I think when I stare up at the blanket of stars. Maybe there's a part of that old Ojibwe legend alive within me, or maybe it's just a latent wish for more, for a bigger experience than this earthbound reality. But water on Mars gets me thinking. If star people did come to the Ojibwe, where did they go? Where did they come from? Who brought teachings to them? What scientific magic did they own that allowed them to make such an incredible journey? And is it possible for us? Sure, that sort of thinking doesn't pay the rent or solve any legitimate earthly problems, but it does make the head and spirit swell with possibility, and maybe, in the end, that's the role of science, the aboriginal kind and the Western kind, to invite us again into the world of the possible, to make us wonder again. So I'll keep on looking up to the heavens, just as I'll continue to look at the world around me with fascination and wonder, because that's the biggest gift the star people likely left behind, a sense of awe at the splendor and magnificence of the universe.
Time has come to see the world as it is.
This article is called Wikileaks Cables Confirm Existence of Extraterrestrial Life. It was posted to collectiveevolution.com on June 29, 2013 by Arjun Walia. We're halfway through 2013 and the world continues to wake up to the fact that we are not alone in the universe. Just this year we've seen a tremendous step forward regarding UFO disclosure. In early May, researchers, activists, political leaders, and high-ranking military agency personnel from around the world testified to the reality of the UFO extraterrestrial phenomenon in front of several former United States members of Congress. Prior to the recent hearings on UFOs and extraterrestrial life, we've had explosive statements made by NASA astronauts and professors. Not only has the world heard from all of these credible people, it's also been privy to official documentation released by dozens of governments worldwide that outline the reality of the UFO phenomenon. Documents indicate that UFOs are of concern to governments, who put a significant amount of time, effort, and resources into studying them. Apart from governments, agencies like the National Security Agency also released official files regarding UFOs. It's now a fact that UFOs are tracked on radar, performing maneuvers that defy our current understanding of physics. This is no longer a conspiracy theory, it's a fact. Release of files began early in 2007 with the UK, and since then, they've released thousands of pages every year, with the latest ones published in June 2013 made available through the UK's National Archives. Now, a quote from former CIA Director Roscoe Hillenkoetter for 1960. Behind the scenes, high-ranking Air Force officers are soberly concerned about UFOs, but through official secrecy and ridicule, many citizens are led to believe the unknown flying objects are nonsense. The UFO extraterrestrial phenomenon is extremely top secret. Access to this type of documentation and the deeper truth behind it is almost impossible. CIA directors, presidents, and other high-ranking officials barely have had any access to these programs. That being said, all of the information that's already out in the public domain is overwhelming. It makes you wonder how far down the rabbit hole this topic goes. As most of the world today already knows, Wikileaks is an international non-profit organization that publishes secret information, news leaks, and classified material from anonymous sources. They've been a tremendous threat to the controlling elite for a number of years and have gained the attention of major mainstream media outlets worldwide. For the most part, these mainstream media outlets have bashed WikiLeaks leader Julian Assange, arguing that the release of classified documents threatens national security, but in reality it threatens only the ruling elite. Since a large amount of official documentation has already been released, the documents from the WikiLeaks cables shouldn't come as a big surprise. Assange has already mentioned that there are yet to be published cables that reference UFOs. Here are some quotations taken from official transcripts via the official WikiLeaks cables. On January 13th, Ambassador called on Dushanbe Mayor and Chairman of the Upper House of Parliament, Mamasad Ubaidulov, at his parliamentary office. The mayor began the meeting with a lengthy discourse on Afghanistan, thanking the United States for its contributions and sacrifices there, and saying that U.S. activities there were very important, quote, as we enter the third millennium and the 21st century, end quote. Ubaidulov thought the main task there was to build a sense of national identity among ethnically disparate groups, and said the United States was an example for this. He noted that, quote, war is very dangerous and said, quote, we know there is life on other planets, but we must make peace here first, end quote. There's a quote from Julian Assange. I have said in passing there is information about UFOs in Cablegate, and that is true, but these are only small passing references. Most of the material concerns UFO cults and their behavior in recruiting people. For instance, there is quite a large cabal, which we'll try and release in the next few days, concerning the Raelians, a UFO cult which has a strong presence in Canada and was of concern to the U.S. ambassador in Canada, end quote. A statement given by Julian Assange himself raises the need for further inquiry. The audio on that video may be delayed, but we can still tell it's real through a number of means. The voice is clearly Julian's, for instance, and lip reading will show that the text matches the audio. Also, multiple mainstream media outlets, Telegraph, CBS News, and more, published the original version of the video, which was taken down immediately. One of the mainstream media outlets was Forbes, where access to the video has been cut off, but the original version had perfect audio and was in the same setting. It's not surprising that the U.S. ambassador in Canada was concerned with this group. High-level agencies are also concerned with abductees and ET contactees. Their mail is stamped in a special way, they are constantly surveyed by Army intelligence, and their phones are tapped. Agencies that are active in the UFO phenomenon keep close tabs on UFO extraterrestrial activity outside of their sphere of influence. That being said, it's no surprise that the U.S. ambassador had an interest in this UFO cult. Anything extraterrestrial would be a concern to the elite, as they are the ones actively covering it up.
Time has come to see the world as it is.
This article is The Brain as Tuner. It is by Richard Grossinger, and it was posted to realitysandwich.com in August 2017. The following article was originally published as part of a book draft entitled Bottoming Out the Universe, Karma, Reincarnation, and Personal Identity. The parallels between the assassinations of Presidents Abraham Lincoln and John F. Kennedy, a century apart in oft-cited incongruity, fall well within the statistical parameters of chance. Even so, something does seem to be holding them together. The two charismatic politicians were elected to Congress in 1847 and 1947 respectively, to the presidency in 1860 and 1960. Both were involved in famous debates, Lincoln with Douglas, Kennedy with Nixon. Most strikingly, as if the cosmos were toying with us, Lincoln had a secretary named Kennedy who warned him not to go to the theater that night, while Kennedy had a secretary named Lincoln who advised him against a trip to Dallas. Lincoln sat box 7, Kennedy rode in car 7. What about Joseph Figlock, who in 1930, while passing a second time beneath a window, caught and thereby saved the life of the same rambunctious infant? What about the 1920 train on which the only 3 passengers discovered that they were Bingham Powell and Bingham-Powell? What about a man, his son, and his grandson, who were all struck and killed by lightning in the same backyard in Taranto, Italy, decades apart, a series beginning in 1919? What about the twin boys separated at birth, both named James by their adopting families, both trained in police enforcement, both marrying women named Linda, both getting divorced and remarrying a woman named Betty, both named their sons John Allen, though one used a single L, both had dogs named Troy. These coincidences came to light when they were reunited in 1979 at age 40. Again, with so many events and so much information flowing through semantic universes, some of it is bound to stick coincidentally, but Betty, John Allen, and Troy? Maybe another reality is being experienced through a glass darkly. Subjective accounts of non-local ranges of consciousness run a gamut. Memories of pre-birth existence, near-death experiences of tunnels through which a mind form travels to a realm where its bearer is welcomed by relatives and guides before returning to the physical plane, ghost journeys through hospitals while in surgery during which a patient reports on objects and events viewed in the hospital. In remote viewing experiments, consciousness seemingly violates the laws of time and space, travels on its own, and imposes its primacy on matter. Telekinesis, the dislocation of matter by mind, combined with remote viewing and quantum entanglement, connect us, at least hypothetically, to the far reaches of galaxies and quasi-stellar objects. Quantum collapse is non-locality in spades. These events and propositions are undesignated in their relation to mainstream science. They are ignored or blamed on inaccurate perception, error, intentional deception, lazy thinking, and religious or superstitious belief systems. Collectively, anomalies place no weight at all on the scale of materialism. The whole is patched as soon as it forms. Science avoids having to jump its own paradigm. As long as the basis of consciousness is circumscribed solely in a brain, there is no other reference point. A mind separate of a brain cannot travel through space. There would be nothing to generate bioelectrical impulses in cognition. While a body is on an operating table, its consciousness cannot wander down halls and look at waiting rooms, operating schedules, and name badges on orderlies. That's ridiculous, absurd. Such illicit traipses are coincidences, contaminated evidence, or fake and coached recitals. A personality cannot reformulate itself after the destruction of its brain. It cannot transfer its memories abracadabra to a new cellular matrix. There is no mechanism for a transfer or agency whereby thoughts, identities, or memories of one person can pass intersubjectively into the mind of another. Reincarnation is not only unverifiable but impossible. Neurologist Oliver Sacks' common-sense explanation for near-death experiences sets up shop where all serious quests for the artifacts of consciousness land these days, in the mirage machine of the brain. Quote, the fundamental reason that hallucinations, whatever their cause or modality, seem so real is that they deploy the same systems in the brain that actual perceptions do. Hallucinations, whether revelatory or banal, are not of supernatural origin. They cannot provide evidence for the existence of any metaphysical beings or places. They provide evidence only of the brain's power to create them. That was taken from Seeing God in the Third Millennium, from The Atlantic, December 12, 2012. That is, non-local journeys of the mind seem real only because they run through the same neural circuitry into the same cerebral lobes as proprioception of concrete things. They read as real only because the mind is tricked by chemical electricity into believing them. The brain erroneously validates them like a rubber stamping machine that has stopped looking at the documents it is authorizing. Consensus reality constitutes a sealed loop. By the same token, however, this entire reality, including the brain's role in manufacturing it, has no ontological status apart from the provisional one we give it. The brain is not organized or positioned deeply and objectively enough to give a verdict as to its own objective existence or the existential basis of its flow of information. Why give its process of information exclusive provenance? Who is some guy manning a piece of fancy machinery on a blue water world to proclaim any and all outlier dimensions are mirages? When Dr. Sachs says that hallucinations are not of supernatural origin and do not provide evidence for the existence of metaphysical realms, only of the brain's structure and its mirage network, he is either missing the point or taking ungranted prerogative. I get his intent, and, within materialism's boundaries, it is a sound one. The brain is creating reality, a single cohesive phenomenon processed inside its own neural matrix, and there is no superordinate metaphysical as opposed to physical event. Another possibility, however, is that neural membranes, matrices, and networks have evolved by natural selection and genetic parameters as conductors of a transcendental current, having evolved not to create but to intercept waves of information passing through the universe at the discrete frequency of protoplasm. Since atoms are mostly empty space and curvature, mind is a broadcast at the frequency of the electrical energy behind their configurations and thus is present, or incipient, not just in the brain but everywhere. The organ itself, in invertebrates a nerve net, in free-living cells a charged membrane, is a formation that has evolved in bionts to process reality in some fashion. To that degree, all forms are sentient in their way. Even stones have elements of primordial consciousness, for they are composed of the same vibrating atomic states. Everything in the universe that isn't animate and conscious is incipiently animate and conscious. The brain's lobes are not source originators and prime movers of consciousness, but transformers, capacitors, and tubes in the manner of an old-fashioned radio. They elicit the stream of sensations that accrue as consciousness, but don't produce them. Consciousness is not a property of the brain, but pre-exists as a universal force like gravity or heat. If you smash a radio, the music stops, but that doesn't mean that sound waves no longer fill the surrounding air. Meanwhile, a subtler brain-like complex located in Hindu cosmology at a chakra above the crown is processing a fuller landscape of reality unconsciously. The brain that we know is that higher organ's homunculus or shadow, so sometimes information from higher octaves seeps down into it. Animals, plants, and even inanimate crystals tune esoteric information by their nature and placement in the universe. Trance mediums and shamans in cultures that train higher frequencies believe unconditionally in their ability to exchange information with disembodied entities and channel spirits with higher intelligences, including their own friends and relatives who have passed. Some perform this operation as an intermediary for another person, becoming a conduit for information for which they require no cognition themselves. In these instances, the medium is often asleep and does not experience the message in persona that is passing through his or her transmission of it. In another set of protocols, contemporary shamans practice transferring their own subjective consciousness to a plant or animal or other form as a way of training non-local consciousness, that is, specifying the movement of mind with some degree of self-recognition and discrimination so as not to get tossed about at death at the whim of samsara's surface winds. Tibetan lamas burnish a specialized application of this art in Phowa, whereby an adept leaves his body while specifying where his identity vector will attach next, not only in living exercises but after death. That's non-local praxis. To the scientific establishment, it is an absolute hoax, but to those who hone such arts, it is the most serious fact in the universe. This division cuts through the heart of modernity. Nikola Tesla, Sir William Crookes, Sir Oliver Lodge, and Lord Rayleigh, all participants in the technology from which radios were derived, reasoned along similar lines, and each arrived at the notion that he was working with borderline psychic energy and his mechanical tuners were intrinsically occult. This view has been marginally reinforced by the preference of non-local thought forms and spirits for electronic devices, televisions, radios, telephones, global positioning devices, computers, and the like. Telegraphy, telepathy, and the internet converge as means for intercepting and transmitting information through the cosmos. A hawk or bear at large, as much as an electrically charged console, they are all consoles to the greater cosmos. I'm not saying that, Sachs isn't right, I'm just saying that other interpretations fit the same evidence. Dead reckoning is real, it's where creature life begins, how a reptile cracks its egg and crawls out of its reality into the next.
Time has come to see the world as it is.
This article is How I Freed My Mind from the Cult of Materialism by Michael Grosso. It was posted to realitysandwich.com in 2017. It is a curious fact that we have successfully used our minds to penetrate profound secrets of the physical universe, but when it comes to grasping the nature of our minds, we are baffled. This is the famous mind-body problem, the hard problem being to account for our consciousness, which is utterly unlike anything physical. The mind, it seems, has a hard time trying to understand itself. In this essay, I describe how I evolved my view of the subject, which is deeply at odds with mainstream physicalism. Without putting a label on my view, there were two kinds of crucial steps I had to take, theoretical and empirical. First, however, a comment on the word empirical. It comes from a Greek verb that means experience, but the modern trend has been to use it only for sense experience, which is too narrow. All kinds of experience are possible, including dreams, out-of-body states, hallucinations, visionary trances, the whole range of reported mental experiences. Certain experiences I had were decisive in helping me form my concept of mind. Very few people are concerned with trying to understand the nature of their own minds. We all use our minds constantly, but rarely reflectively. This shouldn't surprise us. Our brains evolved to help us survive and replicate in a material world. To wonder too much at the mysteries of being could be extremely hazardous. To do so represents a study called philosophy of mind, one of a subset of problems that come under the heading of metaphysics. The question about the nature of our minds is not only fundamental but riddled with controversy, nor is the topic inconsequential, as I suggest in my conclusion. But here is the problem. In an age of advanced physical science, a certain default conception of mind has gelled into a state of uncritical acceptance. Although people constantly use mental terminology, the problem is on my mind. I dreamed of my dead aunt. I remember the first time we met. I am afraid to take the exam. I felt that was a beautiful piece of music, etc. The mainline view has taken the form of physicalism. According to this view, our mental life is in one way or another reducible to some set of physical conditions, especially if they are brain-based. Talk of mind for many who subscribe to physicalism is pegged as folklorish. It's talk of something that either doesn't exist, or if it does, is some kind of puzzling illusion without any real effects on anything. My instinctive response to that self-satisfied conceit: bullshit. I first became conscious of this situation when I was in graduate school at Columbia University. I recall one day casually mentioning to a fellow student that from time to time I had psychic experiences. My friend looked at me rather wide-eyed and said, "But that's impossible. It would imply dualism." Evidently, it was official. I could not have had the experiences I said I had. I realized there was a choice: ignore, deny, and destroy my own experience, or reject the mainline dogma that my fellow student had blithely repeated. One thing I learned from this exchange: the counterintuitive anti-mind position is entrenched in the prevailing educated culture. It often seems necessary to have a jolting psychic encounter before one comes out and opposes the reigning dogmas. Neuroscientists who have near-death epiphanies make strong witnesses, willing to come out and challenge mainstream materialism. After graduate school, I continued to have psychic experiences that were officially forbidden, telepathic and precognitive, as well as incidents of unexplained physical events, and even some that pointed towards post-mortem survival. All these are officially forbidden because they contradict the materialist creed. They imply the independent reality of mental occurrences and therefore perhaps of a mental world. But most outrageous would be anything suggesting that people survive bodily death. The official standpoint wants us completely and totally dead. I knew I wasn't the only person in the world to have psychic experiences, so I met others who had been in the metaphysical twilight zone, began to read the vast literature on the subject, and got to know contemporary researchers. All of this information, and all the persons involved in this largely extra-institutional field of study, altered my perception of reality. I learned to see myself in a different light. I often had dreams that I lived in a house with rooms I didn't know I had, rooms that opened up into wild landscapes. I would often wake up feeling both uneasy and exhilarated. I was confident I had hardly begun to know myself, and here is one coup I can boast of: I learned to resist feeling nauseated when I listened to know-it-alls pontificate about the non-existence of things I knew by acquaintance. I taught college-level courses on psychic phenomena and found that virtually all my students were able to write reports, given highly specific criteria to guide them, on cases of apparent psychic performance they were able to dig up from their immediate social environment. Add the constant appearance of such phenomena as themes in movies, TV, fiction, art, now everywhere on the internet, and finally, in scarcely a minor matter, the whole history of especially the so-called religious history of humankind is oozing at every pore with all that officially forbidden psychic, spiritual, and mystical stuff with its attendant physical weirdness. The most extraordinary case I came across was the ecstatic, Joseph Cupertino, a full-spectrum thaumaturge, and in my eyes a neat mock-up for a postmodern Superman. How the massively profound and mysterious experience of the human race can be squeezed into the pint-sized intellectual apparatus that reductive physicalism is beats me. To insist on such a tyrannical, constricted peephole into reality is a war crime against the human spirit. The main point: my own experience and the experience of countless human beings blatantly contradict the little jailhouse worldview of reductive physicalism. So much for that initial, but for me decisive, first step in talking about the nature of mind. As it should, experience trumps theoretical obsession. Now on to theory. Certain theoretical steps freed me to form a picture of mind more in tune with my experience. Ideas of William James, Erwin Schrödinger, and Carl Jung combined to get rid of an oppressive assumption. As long as I saw my mind and interior world as solely an outgrowth of my brain, my existence seemed that of a doomed outlier, a creature tainted to the core by contingency and suffering from severe causal impotence. William James, however, offered an alternative view of what might be going on. In a lecture on immortality he gave to a Harvard audience at the end of the 19th century, he was faced with trying to account for a variety of human experiences that made no sense in light of the new scientific materialism, according to which everything mental must be some kind of secondary side effect of the really real stuff, the physical. James showed that we are free to assume that consciousness does not emerge from the brain at all. We may in fact assume that brains transmit but do not create consciousness. Consciousness may be a reality, or a dimension of being, in and of it and even for itself. Mind, not derived from anything physical, does interact with the physical. So we can grant all the mind-brain correlations of neuroscience without assuming that mind is brain-born or brain-derived. The idea used to illustrate this is a radio or a TV set. What is heard or seen through such machines originates from somewhere outside the machine. The machines, our brains, are detectors, transmitters, transducers of signals, energies, but from elsewhere. Brains are not creators of anything and minds are not machines. My mind, is affected by my body. I can also affect my body, even my brain, and it turns out that the brain is more plastic than formerly assumed. By effort and practice, one's mind can appropriate parts of the brain to reconnect and recapture a lost function. But then brain disease can impair mental function. However, evidence shows that people with impaired brains sometimes recover their mental capacities just before death. This seems to show that impaired brains suppress but do not destroy mental function and content, since the latter reappears as death disentangles mind from brain. The big point learned from James is that although we live enmeshed with and through our brains, our personal mental life is part of a pre-existing and larger reality. The irreducibility of the mind to the brain that James's view entails has been reiterated in a different form in recent times with the talk of the so-called hard problem enunciated by David Chalmers. Now to a big idea. It seemed perfectly reasonable to assume that consciousness, if not brain-derived, is then a given basic part of the basic furniture of being. As far as the mainline view, with a little help from James, we have just turned it upside down. Instead of reducing and eviscerating the substance of mind, we have assigned it a much wider and more fundamental place in nature. There's a second move I made toward the radical liberation of my mental life. Schrödinger, one of the founders of quantum mechanics, declared that mind is and can only be numerically one. There's nowhere in the world of mind that you can carve out pieces so as to make mind plural, as you could a sheet of paper or a carbon atom. This doctrine of the one mind, which inspired Schrödinger, can be traced back to the Hindu Upanishads. The one mind that is filtered through my brain is bound to create the illusion of isolation and separateness. We then naturally identify with our bodies and unique personal perspectives, so the differences between you and me are real enough. And yet, the more deeply we enter ourselves, the more we merge toward oneness of our humanity that lies in our common consciousness. Simply as a practical point, I would say, the way toward the oneness of humanity is not by forcing uniformity, but by not fixating on our uniqueness. We can celebrate diversity without neglecting the underlying oneness of spirit. Another teacher that helped free me to place my mind as the center of my worldview was C.G. Jung. According to Jung, we live from moment to moment and from first to last in a psychical world of images. The stream of interweaving mental and bodily imagery that we experience, punctuated by episodes of more but different kinds of dream imagery, is our existential milieu. There is no exit from this infinitely complex and nuanced world of subjectivity. Jung's psychical idealism, in which the psyche is composed of images, is literally where it's at. It's impossible to exit from our subjectivity. This, however, does not imply solipsism. In fact, it suggests a much wider range of communication potential. According to the physicalist, however, we have no deep communal mental or spiritual roots. We are separate bodies driven wholly and solely to consume and replicate. Aware now of the primal status of my inner reality, of its numerical oneness in Schrödinger's Upanishadic sense, and of its self-existence and pervasiveness in nature, I'm in a better place than I began with the albatross of physicalism off my back. Once we expand our concept of mind, the range of the possible increases exponentially. The idea is not just to think this, but to embrace it as we embrace somebody we love. I want to discuss two big ideas in relation to this expanded concept of mind. The first is the question of life after death, a perennial belief or at least a hope of humankind. No doubt that if the prevailing view of mind as some blurry side effect of living brains is correct, afterlife or immortality talk would have to sputter to a stop. My story is not quite so grim. I can at least report that a large body of evidence exists suggesting that some people survive death with their personalities intact. The vast majority of competent scientists and generally educated people are ignorant of this evidence and seem to lack the curiosity or the courage to look into it with an open mind. I will make one specific point about the idea of consciousness after death. If physicalism were true, we'd have to say no to life after death, but physicalism is false, as anyone with a mind can prove with thoughtful self-scrutiny. So the question remains open. If the model suggested here is true, and consciousness does not emerge from the brain, if in short the brain does not create but transmit consciousness, then brain death would not entail consciousness death. This move will not guarantee there is a heaven, but the scene is shifted to a sunnier living room, a room with bay windows that look out upon what seems a magical and enticing forest. Consciousness after bodily death assumes a new mantle of possibility. In light of the evidence collected by researchers, a country of new thought awaits explorers with honest minds and rich hearts. Given the premise of a primary mental reality, as here put forth, there is another big issue related to rejection of the mainstream view of mind. In the world traditions, besides the idea of life after death, we find ideas of divine agencies, of spirits, angels, demons, gods, goddesses, and so forth. The so-called new atheists have tried to demolish religion, but the critique is shallow, intolerant, and too sweeping. They mostly have nothing to say of interest about the core spiritual beliefs that revolve around the mystical experiences of religion. Expansion of the concept of mind as one and transpersonal, based on our discussion of James, Schrodinger, and Jung, helps us understand how certain religious ideas might arise. For example, the belief in agencies listed above, along with the belief that humans can interact with these higher ones, however named or described. Different cultures and individuals perennially engage the transcendent mind we have described, always in diverse ways, using diverse vocabularies, rites, and myths. While happily granting all this, we also assume there is the transcendent one mind, the one underlying consciousness that seeps into our experience through our uniquely conditioned brains and cultures. This too is real and may be thought of as the matrix of all transcendent experience. In short, while materialists are forced to condemn the whole of religion as nonsensical and pernicious, once we acknowledge the reality of transcendent mind, we can appreciate the positive content of all the religions, but we can, and must, also carry on a critique of the violently stupid and anti-human offshoots of religious psychopathy. I think that a good deal of anti-religionism can be as narrow and destructive as the warped religionism the critics love to attack. This leads to my final thought regarding my evolution towards this highly expanded and radically democratic view of mind. My views are broadly shared by a significant portion of scholars and thinkers living and dead. But at this point we are a minority, a voice in the wilderness of self-destructing neoliberalism, and at a time when physicalist metaphysics and practical materialist ideologies are triumphant almost everywhere on the planet. To take a single but revealing example, consider the amount of money the U.S. invests in its military budget. Of the $1.11 trillion of federal discretionary spending, the U.S. in 2015 consumed 54%, or $8.5 billion on the military budget, equal to the next 7 largest military budgets, China, Saudi Arabia, etc. Now here is my strange-sounding question. How much of the discretionary spending goes to research on what happens to people after we kill them? The answer is, of course, nothing at all. More than half the national treasure is spent on producing and sustaining an unprecedented world-dominating military machine with tentacles and over 800 bases planted all over the planet. This may be an odd way to point out how our civilization operates, but it's only one example of how materialist values are acting out to the detriment of life everywhere. What's clear is that the default option is military, not diplomatic, force rather than persuasion. Another example is the way the pharmaceutical industries are edging talk, and therefore mental, therapy out of existence. Our entire capitalist consumerist economy privileges materialist values such as limitless profit and gratification of appetite over justice and self-mastery. Materialism today is not just a philosophical position to putter with conceptually. It is an attitude, a disposition, a cancer metastasizing in human society. It needs to be not just intellectually refuted, but excised from the entrails of a morally corrupt culture.
Science can explain everything if we look hard enough.
Shut up, science bitch.
Nothing is true. Everything is real.
Not only is he like ruining my life, but with all this God shit that he's into, he could be ruining my afterlife.
It's a sort of interdimensional vagina that somehow appears I can interact with it.
The fabric of the entire universe could be torn apart.
I know my mind is changing. I'm already too far gone to